Any questions, ladies and gentlemen, about any aspect of the Christian faith? Our beliefs, our values, our ethics, any aspect of our Christian faith that you want to ask about? Going once? Going twice, doing questions? Yeah, go on.
In the Muslim faith, there's things that God can't do. I'm not sure if that applies to the Christian faith. One of the things being God becoming man, because that would sort of raise like flaws and dependency and stuff like this.
Yeah. So my first point is Muslims are working to a double standard because they have cognitive dissonance. They haven't fully thought out their own doctrines. So, for example, and I don't know what religion you are, bro, but in terms of Islamic doctrine, Muslims believe that Allah has a veil that he created that limits his own glory from destroying the universe. That's in Al-Tirmidhi, the hadiths of Al-Tirmidhi. Now, that demonstrates that Muslims have in their religion a concept that created things can limit divine attributes. Furthermore, Muslims believe that the Quran is the eternal word of Allah. And yet here it is, well, it's not actually in there today, funnily enough, but usually I carry a Quran in a book form inside my bag. So a book that is supposedly the eternal word of Allah is encapsulated and carried by a man inside of a bag and has entered into creation, carried by a created thing, the angel Gabriel, according to Islamic doctrine. Now, if the Muslim argument was consistent, they would have to admit that this entails imperfectibilities upon Allah and his attributes. But they reject that, and that's where the cognitive dissonance comes in. Because when they address the Incarnation, they use these arguments like, well, these are imperfections not worthy of Allah. But when you point out exactly the same principles in their own religion, they turn around and say, no, these are not imperfections of Allah. That's cognitive dissonance. It's a double standard. And that is how I would answer that. Because if it can be truly held to be true by Muslims in the examples in their faith, they have no basis of criticism to attack Christians in our faith when we're using exactly the same beliefs and principles.
Saying, well, Islam is wrong, so we must be default wrong also. But if they're correct, then you can't be correct.
Can I reply?
So let me explain my point properly. You said there's limitations in a book coming here. We don't necessarily say that's God. We just say the Creator himself, there's things that he can and cannot do. That's not limiting his glory. If anything, that's adding to his glory. So having limitations, being able to not have ultimate knowledge, having the ability to die, we don't associate these with godly characteristics. So if anything, we're sort of raising the value of God as opposed to saying he can do everything. One of them is being lie, cheat, fail to exist, be dependent. These things we would say sort of take away from his godship. So how would you sort of...
Yeah, I'd reply to that by pointing out that you haven't actually addressed the argument that I just made. You ignored it. All you've done is restate the obvious position, which is the Islamic one, the Islamic argument, but you haven't actually addressed with my initial counter. Let me finish.
Sure.
The reality is, if you believe that the veil of Allah limits the glory of Allah, which you do, it literally says that in your text in Al-Tirmidhi, in the hadith, then that means that you have accepted that Allah's attributes can be limited by something that is created. And the Quran demonstrates that there can be something like incarnational, that the attribute of Allah's divine eternal word can coexist in place and time in creation on incan paper. And this is what Christians teach when we say that the divine Son, the divine Logos, took to himself a human nature. Now, does ink and paper have limitations? Yes. Does that limit the divine attribute of Allah's eternal word that coexists in time and place on ink and paper? Well, that's the point, isn't it? Because Muslims would say no. They would say that all those people in Saudi Arabia who are flushing Qurans down the toilet in their thousands, that's something you can look up, it is happening. Those people are not damaging the word of Allah, because the word of Allah is above it, and they're just damaging ink and paper. We Christians are saying that when Christ dies, when Christ is born, when Christ eats, he does so because of a human nature. And yes, that involves limitations on divine attributes like access to, not possession of, divine knowledge. Because if Allah's glory can be limited by the shank, the created veil of Allah, then we also believe that divine access to divine knowledge can be limited by human nature. But the Logos, the divine word, always possesses the divine knowledge, but doesn't always access it because of the limitations of human nature. Do you want to reply to that?
I mean, we don't say God is the Quran. So when it appears on paper form, people are flushing it down.
Yeah.
That's just a materialistic thing at that point.
Thank you. That's what I said it was.
So it's a materialistic thing.
Thank you.
Right? But we don't say God is a materialistic thing. Christians do. But you're saying
it,
because, of course, you're saying it's a materialistic thing because Jesus is in the flesh, isn't he? He's in the physical. Jesus not in the physical.
Can I reply?
Sure.
So Christians, long before Muslims ever came up with the distinction that when these people in Saudi Arabia flush the Quran down the toilet, that they're just damaging paper and ink. Long before that, centuries before that, at the Council of Ephesus, we were very clear that Christ suffered according to the flesh, that Christ died according to the flesh, that the divinity does not die. When we talk about the Incarnation, we expressly state in our articulation of doctrine that the divine does not become human, it doesn't change. Divinity does not change into humanity. So it is exactly the opposite of everything the Dawagandists have ever told you. They're attacking a straw man because they've never bothered to be honest in debate, discussion or study. And they've never actually engaged with what Christians believe. Now hold on, wait, I haven't finished. It is a straw man because I want you to take this on board when you come in next, that we say that the divinity does not change into a humanity. Take that on board when you reply. Now, that is identical to the defense that Muslims give about the Quran and paper and ink. Now, you're right. Obviously, Muslims don't say that the Quran is God. That's totally right, obviously. And that is different from what Christians say when we say Jesus is God. And we'll come on to that when I speak next. But what I want to point out to you is, and I want you to answer this question, can it be in any conceivable universe that the eternal word of Allah can exist distinct from and independent to Allah himself's existence?
I've heard you make this argument before.
Yeah.
I'm not the first person to address that question. I don't have enough knowledge in terms of the divinity of Allah and his relationship with the Quran in terms of time. You haven't answered my question in regards to the attributes of God and him being able to limit himself. There's things that I mentioned, and Islam's not going to help you. I don't know how this is turned into an Islamic debate, and we're talking about God and Allah and the Quran now. My question initially was to you, can God do everything? This was almost at the base of my argument. It was almost, can God do everything? Can God limit himself? Can God fail to exist? Can God do things out of his nature that go outside of his godship? Yeah? And you're basically saying, yes, he can. And well, you are saying. So when Jesus is brought to this earth, he's limited on sort of worldly elements. He needs sleep, he needs water, he depends on gravity, stuff like this, right? We don't believe that giving God these characteristics is benefiting him. We think it sort of decreases his value, decreases his godship. So I don't see how, in a Christian perspective, Jesus being God, or I don't know what your position is on that, the Son of God or God, we don't believe that's possible. That goes outside of God's ability. So that was my initial question.
Can I reply?
Let me sort of just summarize. My question for you was, how can God limit himself? How can he become lacking in knowledge? How can he do these things if it's not in his nature? If you're saying he's the all-knowing, he's the self-sufficient, independent, I believe you also hold those views also. How can he die? How can he create something?
Can I reply? Okay, so
without
right.
using the Islamic
No, hold on. Can I reply? Can I reply? So firstly, you don't get to set the terms of the debate. I will answer the question however I feel is necessary. I'm going to address your question head on, and then I want to make some auxiliary points with regards to Islam. So please don't interrupt when I address the question head on from the Christian perspective, because I have other comments about Islam that I want to make. Okay? Now, to address your question head on, there are obviously illogical things that God does not do. Okay? However, when we say, and I'm going to address the question of Christ and knowledge, we make a distinction between Christ possessing the divine knowledge and Christ having access to the divine knowledge. Let me use a human analogy you're very familiar with to demonstrate what I mean by that distinction. I'm sure you've had examples in your own life where you've gone home, you've put your cash card or your car keys down or your keys down, and then you need them again and you can't remember where they are, and you look high and low and you can't find them, and you're sitting there going, flip, how am I going to get to the shops? And then boom, it comes to you, oh, I stuck them in such and such a place. You remember and you go and get them straight away, you remember. That's an example of possession of knowledge without access to knowledge. That's an example of it. Shows the distinction is a real distinction. And we Christians believe that at the Incarnation, Christ maintains the possession of all divine knowledge in his human existence. But he becomes like us in every way. And to be like us in every way is to have limited access to divine knowledge, because all knowledge is divine knowledge anyway. Everything you know, God knows. So all your knowledge is God's knowledge. You just gain access to things that God knows. Now, so Christ doesn't have access, because that wouldn't be human, and we believe Christ became fully human without changing from his divinity. Now, that I've addressed that point directly, I want to point out something, that you have exactly the same principle in your religion, and you haven't addressed it. The veil of Allah limits the glory of Allah, because if the veil wasn't there, the glory of Allah would destroy everything as far as Allah's eyes could see. Now, what can't Allah see? So that's saying the glory of Allah would destroy everything, which means that he creates something that limits his glory. So in other words, a divine attribute can be limited by a created thing. The principle is the same. It's just we're applying it to more things than the destructive glory of God. Now, additionally, you're saying that, I want to point out to you that Islamic concepts like all-sufficiency that you appeal to is self-contradictory in Islam. Because the idea that Allah is, I think it's Al-Ghani in Arabic, that he's all-sufficient, means that he is sufficient in everything, all the time, in every way. Agreed? Now, if he's self-sufficient in every way, all the time, in every conceivable way, that means that this contradicts the idea of Allah being all-merciful, because mercy cannot exist without two parties, a party giving the mercy and a party receiving the mercy. And thus that contradicts the concept of Al-Ghani. And you've got a contradiction within Islamic theology. Here's another contradiction. Allah is the owner of all things. But in the Quran it says Allah is the inheritor of all things. Well, how can you inherit what you already own? So if you want to talk about contradictions, you've got all those problems in Islamic theology, and our theology is defended by using a principle that you adopted from us to defend inconsistencies, what would be inconsistencies in your theology about the veil and about the Allah, about the Quran just being a book.
I don't think you addressed my question head on like you said you did.
I feel I did, but go on.
I don't think you did.
Okay.
We started to talk about the names of Allah. We're talking about the contradictions in theology, Islamic theology. Again, you're not answering it. You keep comparing the Quran and flushing toilets and all this sort of stuff.
Here we go, found it.
How can God remove his godship? So God can do anything according to you?
Can I reply?
If you can answer that question, I want to have a discussion, because if you're talking for 10 minutes, me saying something and then you keep responding, it's not much of a conversation.
Well, I'm letting you talk, bro.
So in terms of can God do anything? I don't want it to be like 5 minutes. I just want to ask you questions as well.
Right. So I've said that God
But
does.
you're speaking so much, and then you're expecting me to remember.
Well, you finish your points.
The argument, and then
You finish your points, and then I'll reply.
I'm simply asking you, can God do everything?
Right, so I'll reply to that question.
Sure.
Right, so as I say, that which is rationally contradictory, obviously God does not do. You know, it's the classic.
Does not do a
Let's not interrupt one another. You ask me a question, I'm now answering it. If you ask a question, it's on you to hear the answer. So, and then I'll ask you a question. So here's the thing. So obviously there are rationally contradictory things, like God can't create another uncreated. That's a rationally contradictory statement. God can't do that. But when it comes to God entering into his creation by taking to himself a humanity, there's nothing rationally contradictory about doing that. That's well within the abilities of God to do, especially when you consider that Christians don't believe that it involves any change to the divinity, and we expressly say as much. Right now, it doesn't matter what you think. We Christians do say that we express. But now let me ask you a question. Now let me ask you a question. The Quran that I have in a box at home, right? That Quran, right? Is that the eternal word of Allah in creation? Yes or no?
Can I talk now?
Yeah.
So. Again, you answered the question, and you basically said Jesus, well, you didn't say Jesus. God can come into Earth, yeah, and he can basically have limitations.
And you have
yeah. So I don't think that's the case, man. I don't think that's the case, if I'm being honest with you, because you gave an example of things that God can't do out of his own nature. Yeah? I'm saying to you, there's things that God can't do out of his nature, and where does that draw the line? Because I don't know where you get that information from and where I get my information, or who's right and who's wrong. In terms of God's characteristics, what he can and cannot do, where do Christians base that off? The Holy Trinity.
Wait, bro.
So where do Christians get the ideology that God can be a man? Where does it say that? And what's the stopping from being an animal, or what's stopping God from being a tree? You know.
Can I reply?
I'm not finished yet.
Okay.
So it's like, it doesn't really resonate with me too well, because it's like, what's stopping him becoming a tree, for argument's sake? You know. To us, he can't ever be creation, because to be in creation is to be limited. And I don't think you've fully addressed that yet, man.
Can I reply?
Of course you can.
Right. So thank you for admitting that Allah. Thank you for admitting that Allah can limit his attributes, because
I didn't say God can limit his attributes. I said there's things.
Brother, let me reply. I didn't interrupt you. And the best way for this, no, bro, no. You can always come back. You can always come back. If we start interrupting one another, the whole conversation breaks down. You've been super civil. You've been super civil up to this point. So let's just keep it that way. If you've had enough, just call it a day. Right? Okay. So let's just keep it calm and civil. So thank you for admitting that God can limit his attributes. Because you've just said that when it comes to the Quran. And by the way, you didn't actually answer my question.
Exactly. And
I did answer your question several times, and just claiming that I didn't answer your question doesn't mean that I didn't. People will be able to judge from the video. Now, that doesn't matter to me. Now, in terms of, and again, if we just interrupt one another, the conversation will break down. So let's try and keep it civil. You've done great up to now. Now, if in terms of addressing the point, right? I have pointed out to you two examples where Muslims believe that Allah's attributes can be limited: the Quran and the glory of Allah. One of which is, and both of which are limited by creation. Now, Muslims don't infer from that a confusion or a change of the divine attribute. They don't say that the glory of Allah is somehow changed by the fact that it's limited by the veil that Allah has created, or that the eternal nature of the Quran is changed by the fact that it is now coexistent in time and space, inseparable from paper and ink that exists in a box in my room. And now that logic that Muslims are using, they stole from Christianity. We Christians argued that from the 4th century. That's centuries before Islam even came along, and you borrowed our theology to make your own theology make sense. Now, I have addressed your question multiple times. I will address it again, just to leave you without any excuse, and just to demonstrate that there's nothing now but a rhetorical refrain from you, and you're not actually paying attention. We believe that Christ took to himself a human nature and was fully like us. It is not in the way of humans to have access to all divine knowledge all of the time. All humans gain access to what is divine knowledge because all knowledge is the possession of God. We believe that in his human nature, Christ did not have access to all divine knowledge, but that doesn't mean that he didn't possess it. And I demonstrated in my earlier example about the cards and the keys that is an example of a real distinction that makes sense because you live it in your real life. How would you like to reply?
I don't think you can compare me losing my keys and then suddenly remembering where I put them, and then base that on how God's soul works. I don't think you can do that. Just because I forget where my keys are, what's that got anything to do with God? I really don't understand what the point you're making. You either have knowledge or you don't, right? And the fact that Jesus didn't have all knowledge, to us is a big problem.
Sign of his humanity.
Yeah.
Can I reply?
I'm not finished.
Okay.
Again, this is the thing, when you took 5 minutes, I had other things I wanted to say, man. This is why I want to keep it as a conversation.
He did say at one point, he said that...
Sorry, are you letting him into this conversation? Because I will now reply to his points.
No, I'm not.
Wait, hold on one second.
That's fine.
Right, is he now in the conversation? You make this choice.
See, you're trying to dictate the conversation. You said to me, I'm not allowed to dictate the conversation. And then
You
here
can, no,
are.
I'm giving you the option. I'm not dictating. I'm saying you make a choice.
said
Do you
I'm
want
gonna
him?
reply to him.
I am asking you, do you want him in the conversation?
Robert,
If you
I'm
say
trying to
yes,
have
I'll
a-
reply to what he says.
You've made the
I'm not going
point,
to say anything
yeah?
to you, don't worry.
You've made the point, and you basically said God can limit himself because I forgot my keys once. It doesn't really make sense, man. Like, we don't think God can.
Limit himself?
We don't think God can
Limit
do
himself.
things out of his godly nature. I don't say limit or whatever. I don't think God can do things outside of his godly nature. Yeah. So one of his godly nature is being all-knowing.
Okay.
Yeah. I still don't understand your point. Oh, I forgot my keys once. I remembered where they were. Oh, that means Jesus is the Son of God. It doesn't really add up to me.
Can I reply?
Of course you can.
Okay. Now, please note, I'm asking permission each time. No one's dictating the conversation to you. I literally ask you if I can reply. So the point is, what's your name, bro? Mustafa. The point is, Mustafa, and again, everyone will notice you have not addressed the argument about the veil, and you haven't addressed the argument about the Quran. But I have addressed your question about knowledge multiple times. Now, to go back to you to point out something that you missed, Mustafa, and maybe it's just because you're new at this, right? I pointed out to you that there is a distinction between possession of knowledge and access to knowledge, and I gave the example of forgetting and remembering to demonstrate the reality of the distinction. You need to learn to follow an argument. The point that I'm making to you is that if it is possible for Allah to limit his attributes in Islam, which you believe that he does, even if you don't know that he does, even if you have cognitive dissonance over the fact that he does not then mean that you are justified in attacking Christianity, because you employ the very defenses that Christians used centuries before Islam to get yourself out of the conundrum that you're trying to put Christianity in, which is the idea of Allah limiting his attributes, God limiting his attributes. I'm saying God can limit his attributes. You're saying he can't. So then you have to explain the veil and the Quran and how that isn't a limitation on God's attributes. Now, you mentioned about God's nature, and it's a very pertinent point, very pertinent, because the God that you believe in and the God that I believe in are very different. The God that I believe in, his central characteristic is that God is love. So much that we Christians say, "Ubi caritas et amor, Deus ibi est." Where there is love, there is God. That's how important it is to us, that God is love. Now, if you love someone, as you know, Mustafa, if you love someone, you will do things that denigrate your own nobility for the people that you love. Your children, your wives, or your wife, depending on how many you've got, or any number of other people that you love, your mother. Like, would you not humiliate yourself to protect your mother? Of course you would, because you're a loving son. Whereas Allah, by contrast, is a fickle sovereign on a throne who emulates and esteems his own greatness more than anything else. And so, of course, that God would not enter into creation. But I don't believe in a fickle sovereign God. I believe in a loving God. And as you know, love will mean that you will do things that are beneath you. Doesn't mean that you've somehow lost your dignity, but that you do things that are beneath you because of your love. And that's exactly what we believe God did. We're not saying that these things weren't beneath God. We're saying they were beneath God, but God does them anyway because of his love. And that is a far more appealing God in my eyes than a tyrant, fickle, who sits on a throne and only ever speaks to you through letters and emails and messengers. Yeah.
So the reasons why I'm not answering the questions of the veil, there's all these other questions that you're asking me. It was you that was counting down. You were like, oh, going once, going twice, who's got a question?
Yeah.
I asked you the question of limitation and God.
Correct.
Yeah, I didn't even mention about me being a Muslim and me wanting to answer these questions. You're more than aware of like Islam and our views of limitations of God and what we believe, right? I simply asked you the limitations of God. That's the only question that I asked you. So for you to come back and rebuttal and say, oh, you have to answer my questions, you're not answering my questions, you're not listening, you're new to this, how many wives do you have? You're not talking about that. The initial discussion was you were counting down, and I said to you, I've got a question about Jesus, about his limitations of God, and that was my question. You're asking me about, the Quran, you're asking me about all these sorts of things. The veil, and yeah, you said I've probably got 4 wives, probably.
I didn't say that.
Well, you said how many have I got?
I said wives or wife, depending on how many wives you've got.
And again, it's relevant, though. It's not relevant at all. And it's just the question that I initially wanted answering is still not sufficiently answered. Now you can say you've answered it, and if it's not good enough for you, so be it. I don't think it's good enough for anyone here. I forgot my keys once. I remembered where it was. How is that applicable to the oneness of God and his true nature of being, omniscient, all-knowing, no need of water, no independent, It doesn't answer the question. You can't give me an example of a human sort of characteristic that would make me believe that, you know what, Jesus came here, and yeah, he can be limited and unlimited and limited at the same time. It's a contradiction to me, and for that reason, Bob, I don't really believe that. So you can bring up the Quran and the veil. I don't even need to be Muslim or have a faith to have that sort of question. So you can bring up the veil, you can bring up the Quran, and how are they co-silent? It matters none. I can come here as an atheist and ask you that question. Just because you're answering questions that you're pretty knowledgeable in, you can slide your way in and out of these sort of. You can word yourself out of it and try and.
I'll take that as a backhanded compliment.
Well, wherever. You can take it how you want, but in my opinion, he still doesn't answer the question. You can throw stones from glass houses all you want, but for me, it doesn't answer the question. You still haven't given me an example of how God can limit himself and that be logically making any sense. So what stops God from dying? Can he die for us? Can he fail to exist as the Father, the Spirit, everything?
Can I reply?
I mean, please show me sort of like evidence of how God could do that, because to me it would go outside of his godship to do it, and that's the question you haven't answered. Outside of his godship, he can't do these things because he wouldn't be God. If God was to say, you know what, I'm going to decide I'm not going to have all knowledge for eternity, or I'm going to be limited, I'm going to have a short time here and I'm not going to be divine and unlimited, what's stopping your ideology from believing that?
Can I reply? Right, so the first point, I want to point out again, you've not addressed the issue of the veil or the issue of the Quran.
Sorry.
Wait.
I mentioned
Mustafa,
that I don't need to answer
if you're getting tired,
no, I'm not getting
if you're getting tired, if it's getting too
I
much for you,
answered
just take a step out, bro.
I answered that. I
Like,
said to you, I don't
if
need
you
to
can't,
answer that because you
if you're
asked me-
gonna interrupt,
you gave
the
me-
whole conversation will break down. And I guarantee you'll sulk if I start interrupting you. Everyone who interrupts me always does. Right, thank you. So, I'll just point out again, Mustafa, you haven't addressed the point of the veil and the Quran. Why is it pertinent to your original question? Because these are examples in Islam of Allah limiting himself. Because his attributes are not him, but they are not separate from him. In other words, there cannot be a universe that exists in which Allah's word or Allah's glory exists independent from the existence of Allah himself. In other words, they are dependent existences. And so if Allah is limiting his word as he does in ink and paper, or he limits his glory as he does with the veil that he creates, then Allah has limited an attribute. And we are talking about an attribute, the knowledge, or more particular, if you had listened carefully, Mustafa, we're not even talking about whether God in the Incarnation limits his possession of divine knowledge. We're pointing out that God in the Incarnation limits access. So it's the attribute of access to divine knowledge that is being limited, not knowledge itself. I hope I'm being really clear now. And I have answered this question several times, but I'll do it again. In what way can God limit himself? You asked. The way that he does it in a way that doesn't sustain a contradiction is this. By taking to himself a human nature that does not change his divine nature. If the limitations are encapsulated in the human nature, then that is how, and he experiences those limitations in that human nature, then that is how God can limit himself without change. But now let me ask you this question. How does Allah limit his glory by something that he creates, and that not be the, how is that not the same by God limiting his access to divine knowledge by veiling himself in flesh?
That's all.
Yeah, of course.
Bob, you're saying to me that I'm not listening, right? I don't think you're listening to me. The point that I was making was I can come from an atheistic position, right? You don't need to give examples of Islam, of Judaism, of any type of ism, right?
It's not relevant.
I'm coming to you with a question.
Yeah.
Islam's not going to help you here, right? Islam's not going to help you. Nothing's going to, I could be believing in evolution or whatever, right? It's not going to help me, right? I'm asking a question where you don't need to say, oh, in the Quran or in Islam, look, there's this same ideology problem, there's this same contradicting problem. You don't need to say that.
What's the question, Bob? I want to hear the question. What's the question?
We missed it.
If you draw him in,
I'm
want to hear the question.
let's just finish our conversation. Yeah.
I have a issue myself. I have to just focus, especially when you're talking for about 10 minutes. It's almost
promise
like I
you
need
I'm
to
not.
write it down, man.
I promise you I'm not.
It feels like 10 minutes when he's talking. I don't
It's a
know.
lot of waffle.
And it's a lot of questions and it's a lot of going back and forth. the biggest issue I had with you, let me sort of repeat my argument again, was I don't need to come from any sort of perspective to ask you a question as to why this makes sense. Just because you can say, oh, it doesn't make sense in the Quran, or Judaism says this, I want you to answer that with your own ideology, with your philosophy, right? And use your sources for that. You don't need to start quoting Islam. You don't need to start talking about the Quran, oh, the veil of God. And the reason, again, you mentioned it, which is again a sign that you're not listening, bro. You said to me, oh, you didn't answer my questions about the veil. You didn't do this about, I asked you this, I asked you that. That wasn't that. I came here. You were the one counting down. Again, I have to repeat myself. This is just. It's almost like people are watching this and just like keep repeating the same bit. I have to repeat myself because you're the one not listening. We're not going anywhere. We're going around in circles. I came to you and asked the question. I said to you, the limitations of God. Where do you draw the line? And one of the things you didn't address necessarily. I said, can God become a tree? Can God do this? What is the end of his limitation? How far can he take it? Because one of them is he can limit himself, he can in knowledge and all the rest of it, right? He can be dependent. How far can he take that down? Can he fail to exist completely? Right? That's one of the questions I directly asked you. I said, can he be a tree? To what extent can he lower his godship? That's something you were talking for like 15, 20 minutes it seems.
Didn't answer.
And mate, you were just waffling on and waffling on. You didn't answer none of it. You kept talking about the veil and all the rest of it. You didn't answer nothing I said. You're saying that I'm not listening. I said to you, I don't need to talk about the veil. That's not the conversation at hand. You keep trying to make it comparable to Islam. Forget Islam, man. We're talking about Christianity here. This is your belief system. Can you not defend your belief system without saying, oh, the Quran is this, the Quran is that?
Can I reply?
So the questions that I want you to directly answer, firstly, I don't need to talk about the Quran. Just imagine I'm coming from a perspective of no religion, right? I'm asking you I'm guessing you're a Christian, right? To what extent?
What gave it away?
To what extent can God sort of take down his sort of divinity? How low can he take it? Is my question to you.
Okay.
Without you asking me the veil, this, that, because like I said to you, I don't need to answer that. That's not the topic of discussion. We're talking about Christianity here. We're talking about the limitations of God. And I'm asking you directly, how low can he take it?
Can I reply?
Of course.
Okay. So firstly, you came to ask me a question, I answered your question, and then you wanted to have a conversation, and that's why we're having a conversation.
Yes, I wanted
And in a conversation, it goes backwards and forwards. And the point that I've made to you that you keep missing, Mustafa, and I'll make it to you again, is that Muslims use Christian arguments to get Islam out of the very problem you're trying to put Christianity in, and that's exactly why the example of the veil and the example of the Quran are relevant. I know your kalam better than you do. I know your deen better than you do. And it's incumbent upon me to try and educate you and to help you, right? Because pride in our muscles is not the same as pride in our intellect, right? And we shouldn't have pride at all. But the point that I'm trying to make to you is if you can't answer the very question you're asking, when the very question you're asking puts Islam in a problem, or rather, and this is more pertinent to the original question, you can't see the parallel of the answer that I gave to defend the Christian position as already existing in the Islamic position. To get Islam out of the very conundrum that your question would put it in, then there's no helping you, bro, Mustafa. Like, you're just not able to follow an argument. Now, to answer your question, how far can God limit his divinity? Yeah, I'm getting there. Which is better than you because you haven't got there at all. You haven't answered one of my questions, and you haven't been able to answer one of my questions because when you try to answer one of the questions, your whole argument becomes unstuck. Right? And that, my friend, is not waffles. That's just facts. Now, so I'm going to.
It's been like 5 minutes.
But if I interrupt you, you'll complain. So don't interrupt. Don't interrupt because I'll start interrupting you. The whole conversation break. Are you sure?
You can do that.
Okay, great. So now, to answer your question directly, God limits his nature. God limits his divinity in human nature according to his nature. His nature is love.
What was my question, bro?
His nature, how low can that limitation go? You've got to pay attention, Mustafa. I'm answering that question. If you interrupt less, you'll hear the answer. Yeah?
I've interrupted twice now.
Yeah, multiple times.
I'm trying to direct you to
Multiple
the question I
times.
asked about 10 minutes ago.
Multiple times.
I'm literally just trying to direct you.
And I hope you remember this
How
behavior when
how
I start
low-
interrupting
how low
you.
Can God take it?
So now let me ask, so to answer your question, he does so according to his nature. His nature is love, and the object of his creation, the object of his love is man. And so he limits himself to the form of man. That's how low it goes. Now let me ask you a question again. How can it be that Allah's glory can be limited by a veil that Allah creates?
You done, yeah? You feel free to interrupt me if I'm saying anything that goes.
I will.
Feel free to.
Against my question.
No problem.
So what was my question?
The question was about the veil and how does that sort of. I have a contradiction problem because if I'm saying.
The question is, I'll state it again because you didn't hear it, because you're not listening. How can Allah limit his glory? And I answered that. I said human.
So human is the lowest it can go.
You heard it. There you go.
That's
That's
the
twice now. So you see, if you pay attention, Mustafa, it helps. So in terms of the question, my question is this: how can Allah create a veil that limits His glory? That's the question.
So, like I said, you didn't answer. You said, how low can it go, right? And you said human form is the lowest it can go.
Which is the answer to the question.
So that's
Thank
the
you.
answer to the question.
There we go. I'm
So
glad we
I
agree.
asked you- I
So now
asked
my
you,
question.
Why can't he become a tree?
What's
Why
my
can't he
question?
become a pigeon? Why can't he
Answering.
become a-
That's not my
a leaf?
question. What's my question?
That's what I asked you. You
What's
said
my
you
question?
answered it, and I said, how low can God go?
And I answered that. I
said
said human.
human form.
There you go. Thank you. So you've admitted that I did answer the question. So now you answer
fully,
my
not
question.
fully.
So now you answer my question. And the question is, how does Allah create a veil that limits His glory?
You haven't answered my question.
Go on, answer that
You haven't
question.
answered my question fully.
You know, you're running
I said to you,
Mustafa from the
what's
question.
stopping God from being a tree.
Mustafa,
If
you're
God
running
wanted-
from the question.
I'm really not. I asked
Mustafa,
you a question.
you're running from
you
the
haven't
question.
answered it, and I'm trying to.
What
go
was
back
the
to
question?
The question that I asked you.
What
and
was
you
the
didn't
question I
answer.
asked you?
I said
What was
to
the
you,
question
what's
I
stopping God
asked
from
you,
being a tree,
Mustafa?
man?
What was the question I asked you?
It's hard to follow you.
What was the question
It's
I
hard
asked
to
you? No,
follow
no, you
because
did. You repeated the
waffle
question.
on
So
for
you
like
did
10
follow
minutes.
me. So now you're lying.
You asked me.
This is just
the veil.
rhetoric,
You asked me
Mustafa.
about
Answer the
veil. You asked me
question.
about the veil.
Yes, so answer the question. Answer the question about the veil. I've answered your question. You asked me how low can it go. I said human, and you repeated the answer, thus
elaborate.
demonstrating
Elaborate on
that I'll do that next. That demonstrates that I did answer the
Elaborate on it,
question.
'cause then you
So
haven't
now
answered it.
you answer my question. How can Allah create a veil that limits His infinite glory?
So you haven't answered my question.
You're
because
running from the
I'm
question,
saying to
Mustafa.
you- if I'm saying to you,
You're running
elaborate,
from the question.
you
Answer the
haven't
question that I
answered the
asked
question.
you. What's the question I asked you?
You were talking for 10
Answer the
minutes.
question
You were
I
talking
asked
for 10
you.
minutes. And
I
asked
answer
one
you,
thing, how
and
low
you've
can you go?
demonstrated
And you
that
said
I
one word,
answered that question.
Human.
Look, Mustafa,
That's
this
not it.
conversation, exactly as predicted, when you said we can just interrupt one another,
course, man.
has now broken down.
No, it hasn't.
It has, because I've demonstrated that
All
you're
it's
not
done now-
answering the
all it's done
question.
now is I'm highlighting the fact that
I've
I
answered the
asked you,
question
why
by
can't God
repeating
become
my
a tree?
answer, but
didn't
you have
answer.
failed to
Didn't answer.
answer the question that I've asked you. And I
No,
don't blame you.
answered that after.
And the reason why I don't blame you is because Islam is intellectually bankrupt.
Okay.
And the Dawagandists and these Dawagandist arguments are built on double standards. They're built on straw manning Christianity and not even having an appreciation of your own deen, as you, my brother, have amply demonstrated.
To you from the very beginning. Let me say one thing.
No, it's up to him whether you get to come into this conversation.
I'm not gonna get in, but I just had a question.
I think we're finishing.
We're done.
Right.
What is the
We are indeed done.
We
are
let me
indeed
say
done.
this, yeah? My initial response was, you asked if there's a question. You didn't say, do you want to have a debate? Do you want to have a conversation back and forth where we're not going to interrupt each other? Bob, I come up to you and I said to you, I was asking you about the limitations. My question hasn't changed. Right? I said to you, why
I
can't God
answered it
become a
multiple
tree?
times.
Like, how low can it go?
I answered it multiple
You didn't
times.
say anything.
I answered it multiple times.
You didn't say it.
No, I really did, and the cameras
say
will
it.
show
You
it.
didn't say God cannot not exist.
The cameras, the camera evidence will demonstrate that this is just rhetoric.
No,
All you've got
I'll tell you why.
is
said man.
empty
That was it.
air and
How low can it go,
loud
man? I
noise.
said elaborate and he
You
didn't.
haven't been able to answer
You
a
haven't
single
been able to
question.
elaborate what you
Mustafa,
meant by
do you
man.
want? Shall we bring this to a stop? Because it's not going anywhere
No,
anymore.
because you're not answering
You
the
look after
question,
yourself.
man. Take care, Bob.
Take
All the
care.
best, man.